The simulation mannequin had been hemorrhaging for 3 minutes before Team Ironside's lead finally called it. Time. Kyle Fenner stripped his nitrile gloves with a sharp crack and let them fall to the ground. The high-fidelity trauma simulator lying at his feet, a piece of equipment worth more than most people's cars, showed a bright arterial bleed from the left thigh, untreated, uncontrolled. The digital readout on the scenario controller blinked in flat red. Patient expired. Around the station, other competitors pretended not to notice. Some looked at their shoes. The volunteer scorekeepers wrote their numbers without comment. Kyle crossed his arms and stared at the scattered equipment. The tourniquet was jammed, he said. That's a defective prop. That's on the organizers. His partner, Josh Radley, nodded quickly. 100%. Nobody could work with broken gear like that. Neither of them looked at the old man sitting on a folding chair 30 feet away. He had been there since 6 in the morning. Nobody remembered seeing him arrive. He had simply materialized sometime before registration opened, settled himself into that chair near the equipment staging area, and stayed. He wore a plain grey fleece jacket, the kind that came in a 3-pack from a big box store, and khaki pants with a small ink stain near the right knee. His white hair was cut short, not stylishly short, just practical short, the way a man cuts his hair when he has stopped thinking about it. He held a paper cup of black coffee in both hands, the coffee long since gone cold, the way people hold a cup when they want something to do with their hands. His eyes, though. His eyes moved differently than the rest of him. They tracked every competitor across the training floor with a precision that didn't match the worn jacket or the cold coffee. When a medic's hand position was wrong, his eyes noticed. When a pressure dressing was applied too loosely, they noted the error and filed it behind an expression that never changed. Quiet, serious, and underneath it all, irreversibly sad. The Regional Tactical Emergency Casualty Care Championship drew competitors from across the Mid-Atlantic every year. 42 teams, paramedics, combat medic students, tactical law enforcement units. They arrived with expensive gear bags and the specific confidence of people in their late 20s and early 30s, who had trained hard for something difficult and were beginning to believe they had mastered it. The competition ran out of the Montgomery County Fire and Rescue Training Center, a sprawling complex of burned buildings, obstacle courses, and simulated mass casualty scenes. The director of operations was a man named Tim Gorman, 43, built like a retired linebacker, clipboard perpetually in hand. Tim had noticed the old man when he arrived and had immediately unnoticed him. Elderly man, no name tag, no team bib, no affiliation lanyard. Probably someone's grandfather come to watch a grandchild compete. Tim had a coffee urn that had stopped working at the worst possible moment, a radio frequency conflict between 2 lane supervisors and 42 team check-ins to manage. He gave the old man a 2-second look and moved on. He felt nothing about the decision. That dismissal would cost him something before the sun moved much further across the sky. The old man sat and watched. He watched Kyle Fenner's team move through the vehicle extraction scenario with real, practice speed. They were genuinely good, and his expression did not change when they posted the fastest time of the morning. He watched a young woman from a Baltimore team handle a pediatric airway scenario with a composure that impressed even the senior judges. He watched a team from Richmond lose 3 minutes to a communication breakdown and quietly, invisibly, noted the exact moment their protocol failed. He said nothing, he offered nothing. When a team lead walked past close enough to make eye contact, the old man gave a small nod. The lead walked past without returning it. The degraded equipment station had been designed by Tim Gorman specifically to humble people. The premise was simple: a simulated casualty with a Class IV hemorrhage and a medical kit in which critical items had been intentionally compromised. The tourniquet's windlass was cracked. The pressure bandage had been repackaged with the wrong dressing material. 3 items listed on the kit manifest were absent entirely. Competitors were required to recognize the equipment failures, adapt using whatever remained, and stabilize the casualty within a 5-minute window. No team had completed it, not 1 out of 11 that had rotated through the station before noon. Kyle Fenner's team had been the closest. They had gotten the bleed partially controlled at the 4-minute mark, then lost it when an improvised pressure hold failed. The readout had delivered its verdict. Patient expired, and now Kyle stood with his arms crossed, telling Josh it was an unfair test. that nobody could work under those conditions, that the scenario designers had set them up to fail. That was when he noticed the old man looking at the station. Not at Kyle, not at Josh, at the scattered equipment around the mannequin with those quiet, precise eyes. Kyle felt something he would later be honest enough to call irritation. The specific kind that comes when someone witnesses your failure and says nothing about it. He walked over to Josh, said something low, and Josh's mouth curved. Then the two of them crossed the 30 feet of asphalt between themselves and the old man's folding chair, with the easy stride of people who have already decided how this next moment is going to go. "Hey there," Kyle said. He held out the degraded kit, the cracked tourniquet, the wrong dressing, the gaps where 3 items should have been. "You look like maybe you've seen some things in your time. Think you could do anything with this?" He said it the way you say something when you already know the answer is no. The offer was a performance, and the audience was Josh, and the punchline was already written. The old man looked at the kit. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he set down his cold coffee, stood up, slowly, the way a man stands when his knees have formed opinions about it, and took the kit from Kyle's hands without a word. Kyle glanced at Josh. Josh was already half smiling, waiting for the part where the old man fumbled with the equipment and handed it back. The old man walked to the scenario station. He crouched beside the mannequin with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned not to hurry when hurrying won't help. He set the kit down, opened it, and began to inventory what he had. He did not look frustrated. He did not look concerned. His face held the same expression it had worn all morning, that quiet, serious, permanently sad look that nobody had thought to wonder about. His hands, though, his hands were entirely different from his face. They moved without hesitation, without consultation, as if they had performed this exact task. Improvise, adapt, treat, so many thousands of times that the knowledge had bypassed conscious thought entirely and lived now in the tendons and the calluses and the particular way he held a piece of gauze. Tim Gorman noticed the crowd before he noticed the cause of it. He was 40 yards away, arguing with a volunteer about radio frequencies when he saw that competitors had stopped moving between stations. They were clustering near the degraded equipment area, which should have been between rotations. He excused himself and walked over, pushing through to the front, and stopped. The old man in the grey fleece was working the scenario. He had fashioned an improvised tourniquet from the drawstring of the kit bag itself, not the cracked windlass which he had set aside without ceremony, but the cord wrapped in a specific configuration that Tim had never encountered outside of a special operations field manual. His hands moved through the positioning and tensioning with a rhythm that was almost musical, each micro-adjustment deliberate and precise, and arrived at without any visible deliberation at all. 1 minute had passed. Kyle Fenner was not smiling. He stood with his arms still crossed, but the easy confidence had drained out of his posture the way water drains from a vessel with a crack in it. Slowly, and then all at once. He watched the old man's hands and said nothing. Josh stood beside him, equally silent. The crowd at the edges of the station had grown to 30 or 40 people, competitors who should have been at other stations, judges who had left their clipboards on folding tables, volunteers who had stopped pretending to do other things. They stood in a rough ring, watching hands that appeared to hold knowledge that no currently offered course could fully teach. At 90 seconds, the old man addressed the pressure problem. The wrong dressing was useless for this injury. He set it aside with the same unhurried certainty, and what he did instead drew a sharp inhale from one of the senior judges, a man named Collins, who had served as a battalion surgeon in the early years of the Afghanistan campaign. The improvised wound packing technique the old man used was something Collins had encountered in exactly one place. An after-action report from a joint special operations mission that had been quietly classified and equally quietly declassified a decade later. It was the kind of technique that existed not in textbooks, but in the muscle memory of men who had developed it in the field, because the field had given them no other option. Judge Collins took 2 slow steps forward. His expression had changed. 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The old man completed hemorrhage control, assessed the airway, his fingers moving through a primary survey, with the speed and sequencing of someone for whom this was not a procedure but a reflex. then addressed the remaining treatment priorities using items the scenario designers had never intended to be used that way. A piece of packaging, a length of tape folded and reconfigured. This was not improvisation in the sense of guessing. It was improvisation in the sense of knowing so many solutions that the unavailability of any one of them meant simply reaching for the next. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The old man sat back on his heels, looked at the mannequin, ran through the assessment one final time with his eyes. Then he stood, slowly the knees again, and stepped back from the station. The scenario controller's readout blinked green. Patient stable, time, technique score, pending judge review. For a moment the training center was completely silent, not managed quiet, actual silence, the silence of 40 people who had forgotten to breathe at the same time. Then Judge Collins spoke. "Someone get Tim Gorman up here right now." Tim was already there, had been for nearly 2 minutes. He pushed forward, clipboard in hand, his face wearing an expression he hadn't planned for. He looked at the readout. He looked at the equipment, the cracked tourniquet set aside, the wrong dressing set aside, the improvised solutions that had achieved in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, what 11 full teams with full situational awareness had failed to achieve in 5. He looked at the old man. "Sir," Tim's voice came out quieter than he intended. "I'm sorry to bother you. I need to ask, what is your name?" The old man had retrieved his cold coffee from beside the folding chair. He held it in both hands again. He looked at Tim with those quiet, serious eyes for a moment that stretched just long enough for the people nearby to lean slightly forward without realizing they were doing it. "Wakefield," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Gideon Wakefield." The name did not land immediately. That was how it always went. First the name, then a half-second of absolute stillness, and then recognition moving through the crowd, the way current moves through water, person to person, the ones who knew reacting first, and their reactions telling the ones who didn't. Judge Collins made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they had known only as institutional history becomes suddenly real and breathing, and standing in front of them in a grey fleece jacket. One of the senior volunteers, a retired Navy man named Beckett, who had come to help with equipment logistics because he had nothing better to do on Saturdays, walked forward 3 steps, stopped and said very quietly, "Senior Chief Wakefield." The words carried weight that is difficult to convey to anyone who did not already know the name. But here is what the name meant, for those who knew it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Gideon Alton Wakefield, Hospital Corpsman, United States Navy, assigned to SEAL Team 4 for 11 years, SEAL Team 2 for 6 years after that, deployed to Somalia in 1993, where he kept 3 operators alive through the night of October 3rd using equipment that fit in his cargo pockets and knowledge that lived in his hands. Deployed to Afghanistan in 2001, 2003, and 2005. Author, unattributed, because he had never asked attribution, of the improvised hemorrhage control protocols quietly incorporated into the Tactical Combat Casualty Care curriculum in 2008, which had since been taught to every combat medic in the United States military. Holder of 3 Bronze Stars with Valor and a Navy Cross he kept in a shoebox in his closet. The man who had trained the medical staff for 2 SEAL squadrons, whose students had deployed to every theatre the country had entered in the last 3 decades, and who had never once called any of it sacrifice because to him it had simply been the job. What nobody in the crowd knew yet, what nobody knew because he had told no one, was that Gideon Wakefield had driven here alone that morning, that his wife of 41 years, Margaret, had died of pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, that his children lived across the country and called on Sundays, that the smell of sterile packaging and latex gloves and the sound of people working hard to save lives was one of the last things that still felt like something he recognized as belonging to him. That was the sadness behind the eyes. Now Tim Gorman could see it. He could not have said exactly how he knew it, but he knew it, the way you sometimes know things about a person when you stop looking at what they're wearing and start looking at their face. Tim's clipboard was in his hand, but he had stopped holding it with any purpose. "Senior Chief Wakefield," he said, "I owe you an apology. When you arrived this morning, someone should have recognized you. I should have asked who you were. His voice trailed. The inadequacy of what he was saying was obvious to everyone present, including himself. The old man shook his head once. Small movement, clear meaning, stop. It was Kyle Fenner who stepped forward then, and this is the part the witnesses would remember longest and tell most often. Kyle Fenner, 28 years old, 3 years out of paramedic school, accustomed to being the best in any room he entered. Kyle Fenner walked forward until he was close enough that there was no pretending he was addressing anyone but the old man directly. His face had changed in the way that faces only change when something real has reached them. "Sir," Kyle said, "we gave you that kit as a joke, we thought." He stopped, pressed his jaw together, started again. "There is no way to make what we did this morning okay. We were disrespectful and we were completely wrong, and I am sorry." Josh Radley stood a step behind him, saying nothing, because nothing he could add would improve on what Kyle had already said. The old man looked at the two of them for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that his hands had carried through the scenario. "You made a decision about what you were looking at," he said. "Old man, worn jacket, cold coffee, you filled in everything else from there." He paused. "That's not a character flaw, that's a reflex. The problem is that reflex will cost you in the field, and it'll cause you to miss things in this job every day, not just about people, about situations, about patients who don't present the way the textbook said they would. You saw what you expected to see." He let that settle for a moment. "Now you know to look again." No anger in it, no performance of forgiveness. Just plain words from someone who had learned things the hard way and was offering them at no charge to two young men who had earned the lesson without meaning to. It was into that silence that the sound of a vehicle arrived. A dark blue government SUV came through the training center's main gate and stopped near the equipment staging area. The door opened and a man stepped out, trim, mid-50s, in the dress uniform of a United States Navy captain, his ribbons and decorations worn with the precision of a man who dressed in them infrequently but took them seriously when he did. He crossed the asphalt with a purposeful stride, and the crowd parted for him without being asked. He stopped in front of Gideon Wakefield. He came to attention, and he rendered a salute, slow, formal, the kind that is a statement rather than a formality. He held it until the old man returned it, unhurried, precise, 40 years of muscle memory, and then he lowered his hand and said, "Senior Chief Wakefield, sir. I heard you were here, and I drove down from Bethesda. I needed to come in person." His voice was steady, but only because he was working to keep it that way. "You trained me at Great Lakes in 1997. I was 22 years old, and I believed I understood something about emergency medicine." He paused. "I understood nothing. Everything I know that has actually mattered in 27 years of service, I learned from you. I have never had the chance to say that to your face." His name was Captain Randall Overton. He commanded the Navy's Special Operations Medical Training Unit at Bethesda. He had built his entire career on principles and techniques he had learned from a quiet corpsman who had never taken credit for any of it. For 2 decades he had told his students that the most important lesson he had ever been taught was that medicine in the field is not about equipment. It is about knowledge that lives in your hands, and that no kit failure, no missing gear, no degraded scenario can take that from you if you have put in the work to make it yours. He had learned that from the man now holding a cup of cold coffee in a Montgomery County parking lot. Captain Overton turned to face the crowd. "I don't know how many of you know who this man is," he said, "but I'm going to tell you because it matters." And he told them, not everything, some of it was not his to tell, but enough. Enough that a paramedic from a Northern Virginia team pressed her hand over her mouth. Enough that Breckett, the retired Navy volunteer who had already known, stood with his shoulders back and his chin level, as if doing so was the least he could offer the moment. Enough that Kyle Fenner, standing at the edge of the group, felt the full weight of what he had handed to that old man settle over him, not as punishment, but as the kind of education that changes a person permanently. Tim Gorman recovered himself last. He waited until Captain Overton finished, and then he said, "Senior Chief Wakefield, it would be an honor, a genuine honor, if you would be willing to work through any of our remaining stations today, or speak to our competitors, whatever you're willing to give." He paused. "We don't deserve it, I'm asking anyway." The old man looked around the training center, the burned buildings, the obstacle courses, the simulated scenes, the 42 teams who had arrived that morning believing they were among the best at something hard and necessary, and who were now standing very still in the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime making that hard and necessary thing look effortless, because he had paid for it in the only currency that purchases real skill: time, repetition, showing up in places no one would choose to be. He looked at all of it, and then he nodded. "I'll take some stations," he said. "I'll talk to anyone who wants to listen, but I'm not an exhibition. Put me in the rotation with the other teams. Same conditions, same time limits." He glanced at the scenario controller, still showing green. Same broken equipment. What happened over the following 4 hours was, depending on who you asked, either the finest training day that facility had ever hosted, or something that existed slightly outside the category of training altogether. Gideon Wakefield moved through station after station, not performing, not lecturing, but doing, and then standing still long enough to answer every question that followed, with the patience of a man who has answered the same questions 10,000 times and has never found them less worth answering. He adapted to every degraded equipment scenario as if equipment degradation was simply the natural condition of things, which he mentioned once quietly, it always was. "Your gear will fail at the worst moment," he said. "Your partner may be down. The environment will not cooperate. The job is the same regardless." He said it the way he said everything, without drama, as a plain account of a world he had lived in for 4 decades. Competitors lined up to show him their technique and ask if they were doing it right. He told them when they were and when they weren't, and in neither case did he make them feel small for asking. He spent time at 2 stations working alongside Kyle Fenner and Josh Radley, and neither of them needed to be prompted by Tim to show up early and stay late. They were there before he arrived, gloves on, ready to absorb whatever the afternoon still had to offer. When Tim announced the final scores, Gideon Wakefield's name was at the top. The margin was not what caused the second silence to fall over the crowd. It was the technique review which the judges had been conferring about for most of the afternoon. After consulting with Captain Overton and Judge Collins and 2 additional evaluators with special operations medical backgrounds, the committee had determined that 3 of the techniques employed during the competition were not currently present in any version of the TCC curriculum. They were forwarding a formal recommendation to the Standards Committee to review them for incorporation. The old man accepted the first place certificate from Tim Gorman with a brief nod. He shook hands without ceremony. He did not give a speech. He picked up his cold coffee, someone having quietly replaced the original cup during the afternoon, and he walked toward the parking lot. Captain Overton walked with him. "The Bureau of Medicine is putting together a recognition event in the spring," he said. "For corpsmen and medics who shaped the training pipeline over the last 50 years, your name is first on the list. Will you come?" Gideon Wakefield opened the door of his truck. It was an older model, dark green, the dashboard worn from a long relationship with miles. There was a photograph clipped to the sun visor. Captain Overton could not make it out clearly in the angle of the late afternoon light, but he could see it was a woman, and he understood without being told what it meant that the old man kept it there. "I'll come," Gideon Wakefield said. He got in the truck and the door closed, and he pulled out of the parking lot slowly and turned onto the main road and was gone. Tim Gorman stood at the facility entrance and watched until the truck disappeared. Behind him, the training center was louder and more alive than it had been at any point that day. Competitors, who had started as strangers, now talking through what they'd seen and what it meant and what they were going to do differently. The conversations were the kind that don't happen often at competitions, the kind that last. The degraded equipment kit was still on the scenario table exactly as the old man had left it. The cracked tourniquet set aside, the wrong dressing set aside, the improvised solutions still in place. The green readout still glowing on the screen. Tim had planned to reset the station for the afternoon rotations. He had decided sometime in the last hour, without quite knowing when he'd decided it, that he was not going to do that. He left the station exactly as it was. He told his staff to leave it. He was going to document it, photograph it, write down everything that had been done and how long it had taken, and the name of the man who had done it, and he was going to put it on the wall of the main training room in a frame, with a placard where every new competitor who walked through that facility would see it on the first day and every day after. Because what Gideon Alton Wakefield had walked into that training centre and done on an ordinary Saturday morning was not, in the end, about a competition or a certificate or a readout blinking green. It was a reminder of something that is easy to forget when you spend your days around people who are loud about what they know and quiet about what they don't. That the men and women who have paid the highest price for their knowledge, who have spent it in places and circumstances and moments that most of us will never be asked to imagine, do not always arrive with a uniform or a credential or anything visible that tells you what they're carrying. Sometimes they arrive in a worn grey jacket with a cold cup of coffee, and they sit quietly at the edge of things, and they watch and they say nothing, not because they have nothing to offer, but because they have long since stopped needing to be the one who announces what they know. If there is someone in your life who served in silence and was never recognized loudly enough, think of them today. And if you have ever looked past someone who turned out to be the most important person in the room, remember this story. The best ones never announce themselves. You just have to learn to look.